Yes, welcome everybody to the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute monthly seminar. And our speaker tonight, I'm delighted to introduce the up-and-coming star, Hannah Genders Boyd. Hannah is the first person to have done an MRes with us at UHI Archaeology Institute. An MRes, that is a master's by research. So it's quite a different master's from a taught master's, where Hannah's had to do a lot of independent research, working as an independent researcher with a team of supervisors. So her supervisor from UHI has been Scott Timpany. Hannah's background is in climate heritage, which is in the intersection between sustainability and archaeology. Before she came to UHI, she studied history and archaeology at Edinburgh University, but she became a well-kent face, as we say here, because she came up to Orkney and helped excavate at the Nessa Brodgar and at the Cairns, both big excavations ongoing in Orkney. So after her graduation from Edinburgh, in 2020, she joined UHI as an MRes student and has now completed. So that's a great success, and we're delighted to hear more about Hannah's research now into the roundhouse societies and these people's interaction with the environment around them. Over to you, Hannah.
Brilliant, thank you, Raggy, and thank you everyone for joining tonight on your Friday night. That's really appreciated, and it's going to be a real joy to chat to you all about what I've spent the last 18 months on. So thanks for joining. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, all going to plan, and we can get going. Can everybody see that? Raggy, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that okay? Brilliant, excellent, good stuff. So yes, so the project was called Out the Round, and the subject that I've given for tonight, the title is Continuity and Connection to Landscape in Hut Circle Communities. So I'll talk a little bit more about that theme and why I've looked particularly at continuity and connection for results. So what was the project? As Raggy said, this was a research master's. It was UHI's first research master's. I was supervised by Dr. Scott Timpany from UHI, but collaboration was quite a strong theme within the research. So I also had a supervisor from Aberdeen, Dr. Tim Mile, and from the University of St Andrews, Dr. Alfie Davis. The full title of the project was Paleoecological Investigation into Human Environment Interactions in Bronze and Iron Age Hut Circle Communities in Gairloch, West of Ross, which is part of the reason I gave it that slightly snappier title tonight. But that is a good description of what was going on in this project. It was paleo-environmental analyses in order to understand the interactions between hut circle communities and their landscape. So how was their landscape affecting these communities, and how were they in turn affecting their landscape? That was bringing in what I was doing was creating a landscape reconstruction, essentially. So using paleo-environmental data to reconstruct that landscape through time. I was also using archaeological survey and excavation data. This was data collected by the WeDigs project, and that's the other really major aspect of collaboration as part of this. The WeDigs group is a fantastic community initiative based up in West of Ross, who have surveyed more than 200 roundhouse and hut circle sites across the region, over the last few years and spearheaded by the wonderful Anna Welty, and hopefully some of them are with us here tonight, I think. This project grew out of an ongoing partnership between the WEDIGS group and the Archaeology Institute, UHI. So I was using data from their surveyed roundhouses and also from 3 roundhouses that were excavated at Achtercairn near Gairloch back in 2012, and a peat core that was taken as part of this ongoing relationship a few years later. So that was where my data came from. So those are some names. Where am I talking about? This map of Scotland that you're seeing now, that red box there is showing where Gairloch is in West of Ross. So it's sort of almost on a par with the northern Trinish Peninsula of Skye. This is a bit closer up, and there you can see just kind of to the west of Gairloch, to the east of Gairloch rather, there's a few red dots there. That's showing some of the surveyed roundhouse sites, some of the many surveyed roundhouse sites that have been put on the map by the WEDIGS community. And here we have a closer up image of the roundhouse sites. This is Gairloch here, and on the bottom of this picture on the left hand side, and the red dots are showing different hut circle sites in the area. And Achtercairns 1, 2 and 3 are the 3 excavated hut circle sites in the region. So it was that excavation data that I was using to understand. And this yellow dot here denotes the site of the peat core. So happily, these hut circle sites all are situated around a peat bog. When that peat bog was cored, it was found to have a really large length of peat, which gives us a good time depth to understand, and there wasn't any indication that it had been cut at any time. So this was kind of the perfect conditions to undertake a paleo-environmental analysis of hut circle sites in Scotland. And also just to note on that, these pictures that I've got behind are from the site visit. I managed eventually to get out to the site despite COVID, and meet some of the WEDIGS group there, and managed to get out on, I think, the sunniest day of 2020. So there's lots of beautiful images of what is a really beautiful part of the world. So this was the perfect conditions to do a paleo-environmental study of hut circle sites. But why bother doing that? Well, there haven't really been that many paleo-ecological studies of hut circle sites in Scotland. Actually, hut circles in general are quite understudied, arguably, as a settlement type. Even that name, hut circle, meaning roundhouse structure, habitation, can be, seen as maybe quite pejorative, and that notion of a hut being indicative of how they were viewed by the antiquaries who first surveyed them. And for a long time, these structures were seen as low status dwellings and therefore not really worth anybody's time. More and more, that's being questioned, and they're being seen as low status dwellings and therefore very much worth our time, potentially because of being indicative of the lives and lifeways and economies of large swathes of the population through the Bronze and Iron Ages. But also, I guess, because of their potential to tell us something about those higher status dwellings that have previously been focused on in the past. So brochs and dunes and Atlantic wheel houses, which are deemed high status dwellings. So where are other people in that landscape, and how are they interacting with the world around them? So that's one reason to now take this paleo-ecological approach to hut circle studies. Another is these bigger questions of resilience and adaptation, two kind of big words that are showing that interest in how people respond to challenges within a landscape, and that's, I guess, becoming increasingly on people's radars as we are facing more environmental challenges in our society as well. There's also a big question in hut circle or has been a big question in hut circle studies, of the question of upland abandonment, so occupation and abandonment, and that's particularly in relation to what we believe to be big climatic changes towards the end of the Bronze Age. There was a previous school of thought that thought that people abandoned upland settlements, abandoned hut circles when there was periods of climatic or weather deterioration. And people have questioned that. Authors such as Petra Dark, as well as many others, have questioned how likely that is and tried to tease out more of a nuanced story of how people really interacted with that upland setting, maybe questioning those sort of core periphery attitudes that kind of argument's grown out of. So that was definitely something that this thesis wanted to address, was this notion of occupation and abandonment. What does that look like in the landscape setting? Part of that is, of course, when we look at archaeological evidence from hut circles, we do see abandonment horizons, and we do see periods of occupation and periods of non-occupation. So trying to kind of get a better sense of hut circles themselves and how those structures and those people who lived in those structures interacted with their wider environment was a key part of this. This links to research questions in the Bronze and Iron Age panels for the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework. So one thing that the Bronze Age panel states is important is to contextualise excavation data within a landscape setting. Very much what we're trying to do, what I was trying to do here. Some of those questions that are brought up in SCARF are things like woodland exploitation, settlement, changes in settlement activity and patterns, resource use, and social responses to climatic change. So that was something I was addressing here. The final, maybe the most important aspect of why to undertake this research was the research aims of the WEDIX group. I'd say this research was born out of that community and born out of that community's initial research and surveying. So it's really exciting that some of you are here today, so I can finally kind of feed back to you what's come out of my part in this project. And yeah, so the research aims of the WEDIX group, one of the things that was stated in the research report from 2012 was the need to get a better sense of how these hut circle communities were interacting with their environment, with their landscape. So my research was there to address some of those. So the next question after why is, of course, how? How did I go about doing this research? So my methodology was based on the peat core that I mentioned earlier that had been taken by Scott Timpany and members of the WEDIX group in that bog in the middle of the roundhouse valley. So this picture that you're seeing on the right there, that's the very end of the bog, surrounded by some of the birch trees that are there now and some of the kaluna, some of the heather that's in that environment today. It's quite a different environment to what we would have been looking at in prehistory. But sort of behind where this picture was taken was where the sampling happened. So from that peat core, I took 26 samples every 3 centimetres along the core. And on each of those 26 samples, I undertook pollen analysis, palynology. And for anyone who's interested, that was to account for 300 total land pollen, making it statistically significant. For those who don't know, pollen analysis essentially involves looking at the pollen grains you're seeing under the microscope and identifying different plant species. So that can build up a picture of what plant species were there in the environment and how those changed over time. As well as the pollen grains, I was also counting non-pollen palynomorphs, which is very fun to say, and denotes things like fungal spores. So things that aren't pollen themselves, but are showing other species within the landscape. This is a less common aspect of paleoecological investigation, but it's really, really useful for understanding things like presence of dung from large herbivores, for example. So that came into my research. I also looked at the microscopic charcoal present in the core, I counted that in 3 size categories, which can give an indication of burning in the environment, and with the 3 size categories, how far away from my site that burning was happening. So large pieces of charcoal at greater than 50 microns would suggest burning happening very close to the site, and smaller further away. I also counted testate inuba. That's in brackets because pollen, preparing samples for pollen analysis can destroy testate inuba. So it's not something to base all of my results on. However, it was a very useful proxy to have in there. The testate inuba can be an indicator of the hydrological conditions on the surface of the bog, so a wetness or dryness indicator. This bog isn't suitable for attempting a kind of climatic reconstruction of the landscape, although we're thinking about some climatic questions in there. But these were useful for thinking about wetness and dryness indicators. So they were used for that. I also took 4 samples for radiocarbon dating. So after a brief hiatus because of COVID and all the labs shut, these went off to Queen's University Belfast and came back to tell me that I was indeed looking at pollen from the period of roundhouse occupation, which was a huge relief. So they allowed me to link my data very strongly with the excavation data that was already there and link it to those roundhouse structures. So alongside all of this environmental data, I was also using the excavation data from the WEDIX report from those 3 excavated roundhouses, Achtercairn 1, 2 and 3. All that data allowed me to make some fun diagrams and things, including this quite fun colourful table here. So this to show you the samples that I took, the depth of the sample within the core, the radiocarbon data that relates to, which I created from a cubic spline model, the kind of general chronology of the sort of age that we're looking at for that, and how that relates to the Achtercairn structures, to the hut circle structures. So here you can see, and the bright yellow dates are the samples that went away to the lab. So here you can see Achtercairn 1, that relates to the late Iron Age to middle Iron Age, and is captured quite nicely in my core. And also Achtercairn 2, which relates to the late Bronze Age, and then Achtercairn 3 that relates to the middle Bronze Age and early Bronze Age. So you can see there's a really significant time depth that we have the opportunity to look at through this core, while the excavation data allows us to have those really detailed snapshots in time. The palynological data allows us to look more broadly at like slow changes through time, and get a sense of how that landscape changed as those roundhouses were occupied. So that then allowed me to map the dates of the known dates of occupation for the roundhouses onto my palynological data. So this quite crazy looking diagram here shows a selection of some of the taxa that I counted, along with the filled in black, which is charcoal data, and the nice colourful bands at the side show the groups of taxa in the environment. So the green one, it's arboreal pollen changes through time. The grey bands denote Achtercairns 1, 2 and 3. Happily they're in order, so that's great. So Achtercairn 1 is this larger band at the top, Achtercairn 2 in the middle, and Achtercairn 3 at the bottom. The second diagram shows my MPP data and how that changed through time. So to pull out some of the results from that data, which there is obviously quite a lot, and hopefully that data can be interrogated by other researchers through time and can be used for future research and future reference, which is great. That's a kind of ongoing legacy of this project, I guess. But some of the results that really jumped out for me, and I would like to draw your attention to just now, is firstly a really strong sense of continuity in that diagram. If I just jump back to this one, for example, if we have a look at that arboreal curve, so the bright green one, you can see there's some changes through time. There's some fluctuation in the amount of tree pollen in the record, the amount of woodland that's in the landscape. But at no point is there a really strong, any really strong episodes of woodland clearance. And certainly we're not seeing deforestation over time. And the reason that that's interesting is because other researchers and other palynological data from this period does seem to show that. So, for example, Selby's research over in the Trottenish Peninsula of Skye, which I dash back to the map at the start, you'll see is really not too far away from my site. So this Peninsula of Skye. Selby has argued that that area that she studied there would have been almost a completely treeless landscape by the Iron Age. So it would have been really significantly deforested over the Bronze Age. If we jump back to this, you can see that's really not the case in this diagram, and indeed actually towards the end of our diagram, towards the early centuries AD, there's actually a bounce back in forest, and there's an increase in the forest, in the woodland, in what would be upland birch forest, upland birch woodland here. So that element of continuity is quite interesting. Another sense of continuity that we get from this diagram is the fact that there's a presence of disturbance indicator taxa present throughout. So those disturbance indicator taxa are things like ranunculi, buttercups, and particularly Plantago lanceolata, which is ribwort plantain. That's a strong indicator of disturbance from things like pastoral farming. It's got quite a strong association with pastoral farming, or potentially arable farming, and is often taken as an indicator that there's a strong association there. The MPP data is consistent with that image as well. So for quite a lot of this diagram, we're seeing a presence of dung fungi, things like HDV 112 and 113, which is suggestive of large herbivores grazing in the landscape, and there being their dung there for quite a lot of this period. So that's an interesting sense of continuity that we're getting through this diagram. Another thing that I was looking for in my pollen data was the presence of cultivation of any sort of arable farming. So seeing if there was any sense of people growing food in that environment. Cereal pollen is notoriously difficult to see in the pollen record. They're very large grains and they don't disperse very widely. However, happily I did find some in my record, and had some interesting results there, in that initially seeing both wheat and barley cultivation in the Bronze Age. Following the end of the Bronze Age, wheat cultivation seems to disappear in the landscape and barley becomes the main crop. This isn't very surprising. This is something that we see in quite a lot of Scotland, with 6-year-old barley becoming the main crop of the Iron Age. So that's interesting to see. There's cultivation happening for quite a lot of the period, the period that I studied, and there is that change towards barley in the Iron Age. Another very interesting aspect of this is there was a period where we don't see wheat cultivation going on. or indeed any kind of arable farming going on. And that is that period from around 850 Cal BC to around 600 Cal BC. This is a period of known climatic deterioration across Europe. Climatic deterioration is a really tricky thing to map and to understand because it can be very localized, it can be very variable in different areas. And the data for Northwest Scotland is quite limited. So it's not something we can sort of definitively say happened in Northwest Scotland, or indeed in Gairloch and Achtercairn. That said, the wetness indicates those hydrological indicators that I was looking at on the bog. So that's some taxa and some of the Tasmanian do suggest a shift to wetter conditions in this period, which would align with that period of more general climatic deterioration across Europe. So there is potentially some correlation there. That is also the period where arable farming seems to come to an end or have a hiatus in the record. What doesn't disappear in the record at that point is NPP data suggesting presence of dung fungi, which I will come back to later. The other final interesting bit of data that I'd like to draw your attention to is the charcoal data, which has some interesting correlations with the excavation data. So I'll just pop back to this, this one that's showing the different levels of the different structures, Achtercairns 1, 2, and 3. So one thing that's interesting is that this large band at the top is showing Achtercairn 1. Achtercairn 1 was the biggest of all the roundhouse structures. It's 12 meters in diameter, so it's really quite a sizable structure, and was interpreted by Welty and Wildgoose, who published the excavation data report, as maybe a structure with a ritual function. So while the other structures were interpreted as being domestic dwellings, potentially there was something a little bit different going on in this large structure, Achtercairn 1. One of the reasons for that was the fact that there was a large deposit of heat-reddened soil found at the base of it, so evidence of a pretty hot fire at some point in that building's life or death. So Welty and Wildgoose interpreted that as maybe it being a beacon, some kind of signalling structure, which is a really interesting theory because, as I say, you can see the Trotternish Peninsula across the water. So any habitation there, which we know was there from the palynological record, there would have been, or potentially would have been, visual interaction if people were living there at the same time. So that's a really interesting thought. When I spoke to Martin Carruthers about this, he also thought that maybe that heat, that strong fire, could be evidence of the end of that building's life, which is also something that we see in the Iron Age, of these kind of dramatic closing ceremonies to buildings. So we're not quite sure what caused that fire, what purpose that fire had, but it certainly happened. That's evident in the archaeological record. If we look at the charcoal data there in that top band, you'll see there's not loads of it. There's not a huge amount going on there. There's certainly not a moment of a huge amount of charcoal in the largest size category showing up as maybe evidence of a huge fire. So that's really important to flag, because what's happened there, I think, or what's worth pointing out there, is that the samples, as I say, taken every 3 centimeters, so kind of taken very close together really on the core, therefore have gaps between them of maybe 2 to 3 generations. So some quite significant gaps. So if this fire was a one-off event, or a very occasional event, then it might be the case that it's not been captured in this record. So that's an interesting thing to kind of flag and to think about, and to be aware of in the way that we can work with excavation data and paleoenvironmental data with these snapshots and these more long-term, long periods of change data sets. Another interesting aspect in terms of charcoal data and some of the arboreal pollen data is if we look at Ulmus glutinosa, which is alder. Alder is interesting in this curve because although it starts off with quite a lot of it in the early Bronze Age, it's one of the ones that really reduces quite quickly. This can be linked to, this can potentially be linked to some of the other excavation data that was found when excavating these sites. A large majority of the charcoal data found within the structures, so within the excavation, was alder. So there's a potential that alder was being preferentially burnt as fuel, and that there could be a connection there between the pressure that we're seeing on the alder population and the habits of the people in the roundhouses. So it's not a definitive link, but it's certainly an interesting one to consider. So from those results, I guess at that point I've already done it. I've already snuck into the interpretation. So this is the next, the kind of how I've drawn on those results to think about what that means for this landscape and what it means for this research. Firstly, that question of continuity between what we're seeing in the arboreal pollen data and what we're seeing in the cereal pollen data and what we're seeing in the NPP data. So that's the non-pollen palynomorphs, the fungal spores and the presence of animal dung, is a really strong sense of continuity. So that's why I kind of named this talk Continuity and Connection. While we've got individual hut circles showing evidence of abandonment and reoccupation, rebuilding, and all sorts of things going on, there's no evidence for a total abandonment of this landscape at any point during this time. That's a really interesting thing to think about. It's certainly a jumping off point. But what it does suggest is that while we don't know exactly what that kind of continuity looked like, while we don't know who was staying or who was going or how communities were moving around the landscape, it does suggest a very dynamic community whose interaction with the landscape did extend far beyond an individual structure. So that's a really important thing to remember looking at hut circles, is that they don't exist in a kind of floating island of a single habitation. They exist in a wider landscape. And when we're looking at this excavation data, we can be thinking more widely about how people were interacting with their environment beyond their dwelling. Another element of that continuity is the fact that there are no major periods of woodland clearance. And that's, I think, where the connection comes in as well. So things like the potential management of resources. This is a really kind of difficult question to answer, but an interesting one to think about in terms of why that woodland isn't cleared. So, you know, we know that it is cleared in places like Skye. We know that in places like Achney Glen, woodland is significantly reduced over the Bronze Age. So the fact that it isn't seen here suggests that it has there's something different going on, or there's some value of that woodland within this community. So when we're thinking about management of resources, that could also be just something like grazing strategies. If people are grazing animals within the woodland that would then give that woodland a certain value for their economic approach. Also, that question of the management of resources is a really interesting one. Something that I explored a little bit in my thesis is the potential for coppicing. There, I've put hazel for building in question mark, because it's very difficult to see something like coppicing within the palynological record unless you're using very fine spatial resolution sampling. But there is some evidence for wattling within the roundhouse structures, or potential evidence. There's smaller post holes found within the roundhouse structures. So we can start thinking about what was being used to build, what was the materiality of these structures themselves, and how might that have changed people's interaction with the environment. So that's an interesting question to emerge from this. The final interpretation that I think is really important to flag is the potential changes in subsistence strategies that we see. I think from this data, we can see at least some kind of change happening towards the end of the Bronze Age. That could well be this climatic deterioration, or a signal of this wider climatic deterioration that's happening across Northwest Europe. Some researchers have described it as the biggest climatic event in that whole period. So it is quite likely that it would have affected Scotland, and this evidence just seems to suggest that it did affect Gairloch. And what we see in that period is arable farming disappearing from the record. That's the kind of thing that, you know, previously people might have shouted, upland abandonment, everybody disappeared. But what we see there is a continuation of the MPP data showing that there was continual large herbivores grazing in the landscape, and the disturbance taxa suggesting that there's maybe still some pastoral farming going on. So what's potentially happening there as the climate deteriorates is that people are stopping growing arable crops, which maybe wouldn't be doing so well in a wetter and, as we see, quite exposed environment, and maybe focusing more on pastoral farming in that period, at least in this area. And potentially that could be happening in the context of a much wider interaction with landscape that goes on beyond the boundaries of this study. So those are some of the interpretations from this work. In many ways, this research can be seen as a pilot study. There is so much potential in this landscape. There's so much potential in these hut circles. Even just within this core people, there's so much more potential. And so it's worth talking about the potential other aspects of research that could go on, maybe in case it sparks anyone's mind to do another research master's, because there's many more in this. One really interesting thing that could be looked at is a closer temporal resolution. So getting a better sense of time changes through this landscape. Better chronologies are always a good thing. And certainly with hut circles and with this landscape, getting a better sense of how, or rather when, people are doing things in the landscape and when things are changing would be really valuable. So, for example, being able to explore that idea of seasonality, which we see at shealing sites. So shealing sites in the post-snow period being used in the summer and not used in the winter, or abandoned in the winter. You know, could that be a parallel here? That's something that's not going to be seen at this scale in the data, but if we zoomed in temporally, there would be a potential opportunity to examine that, and that would be a really interesting question to answer in relation to the economies of this landscape and the uses of hut circles. Another really interesting potential would be finer spatial resolution pollen analyses. As you saw from that map, and even from this picture here of the bog, it's quite a wide area, and there's hut circles all over the place. There's hut circles all over this landscape. So being able to zoom in again geographically and get a better sense of how people are interacting with this landscape, that would be really useful. That's been done in projects such as the Lag project back in way back when, and getting a better sense of how people are interacting with different parts of the landscape. So maybe how they're interacting with the environment right outside of Hut Circle. So doing, for example, micromorphology, doing pollen analysis on the soils in the immediate vicinity could be a really interesting way of seeing, maybe is that where crops are being grown, and then people are grazing their animals slightly further up. What's going on in that landscape? Can we create a more detailed and a more nuanced picture of what's going on? Looking at plant macrofossils, so seeds, for example, would be a really great way of understanding better like what actual species or what individual species are being used, and also where. Investigation of resource management, again, a huge challenge in palynology, and would probably need to be used in correlation, in tandem, that's what I was going for, tandem with plant macrofossils, but to explore things like, were they coppicing? Was there any kind of woodland management going on? Would be really fascinating. One aspect that never quite made it into this project was geochemistry, but would be a wonderful next step for this research or for this area, would be to think about geochemistry is a way to analyse or would be a way to look at pollution in the immediate environment. So that could be pollution from metalworking. This is the Bronze to Iron Age, and one thing that's really obvious in this or appears obvious is this continuity from the Bronze to Iron Age. There doesn't seem to be a big change in lifeways. We have these images of Bronze Age life and Iron Age life, and at least in Gairloch there doesn't seem to be a huge difference. For these communities, they seem to be continuing on much the same, maybe just going over to their barley rather than their wheat. So having a little look at whether there is metalworking going on and what that is and where that is could be a really interesting way to delve a little bit deeper into the lifeways and again into the economies of this area. Animal bone preservation has been quite limited from the excavation, but would be a really interesting way to consider if we're looking at the presence of pastoral farming. What are they farming? What are they eating? Always would be fascinating. Soil micromorphology is something that there's already been some tentative steps towards in this area, and would be really interesting to look at more closely to better understand the architecture of these circles, of these hut circles. So while I was thinking a little bit about, well, is there, for example, hazel being used in their construction? Soil micromorphology could tell us a little bit more about, for example, whether turf was being used in their construction as a building material. That would be really interesting. My final point on this is more excavation data, which happily, this is a very well-timed talk because Dr. Tom Gardner from Historic Environment Scotland is actually going back tomorrow with the WeDigs group to continue excavation at Achtercairn 10, I believe the roundhouse is called. So this is an ongoing project. There's going to be more excavation data coming out of this. I believe Tom's going to be doing some more micromorphology on these as well, and from Achtercairn 10. So that can only be a good thing, and this ongoing project is going to be building up more and more data on these roundhouses. So I guess watch this space and watch the WeDigs group. And that's me. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your research, Hannah. That was fascinating. I've brought in Scott Timpany here, your supervisor, as part of the panel too. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and everybody is really welcome to put their questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and then we'll pass them on to you. I just thought I'd give Scott the chance to ask, to open for the questions if you have any questions, Scott. I think you're muted still, Scott.
me now?
Yes, now.
Okay, it's just okay. I was going to say, do you feel that these communities could be considered marginal, given the locations of these hut circles, or do you feel that'd be an unfair brush to tarnish them with?
Yeah, I guess that question of marginality has been a big one in hut circle studies of hut circles, and I would say certainly not like that sort of dynamic interaction that we're seeing with landscape. In these communities, I would suggest, yeah, these are not people eking out a living on the edge of the world. These are people farming with potentially herds of animals, definitely with arable crops, building houses, living in them, setting them on fire, having a great time. These I don't think are marginal spaces, and I think that's yeah, maybe has been a symptom of the views of the people researching them more than the reality of the excavation and the paleoecological data that's there.
There are people in the chat saying this is absolutely fascinating and very exciting results. Hannah just thought I'd pass that on. Several people have said that in the chat. I was wondering, did you find any pollen from species that are not native to the immediate area? Are they like bringing in and growing plants from elsewhere?
I didn't. That's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting point. Yeah, what I didn't mention, because it's kind of easy to get drawn into, is that my pollen all came from a fairly small area, so just kind of would have captured the area around the peat bog, hopefully capturing a signal from those excavated roundhouses. And yeah, there weren't any major surprises in the species present. Which I suppose in some ways is good, because it suggested that there hasn't been any sort of horrible contamination of the sample or anything. Yeah, would be really interesting. I guess we'd probably need more detailed palynological data from other regions to get a sense of what's being grown elsewhere, and if there were the possibility to be bringing in new grains, for example. And I guess that would be an interesting to look at in terms of that change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, whether that there are changes in what's been grown in there.
I have a question here from Christopher Matthews. He says, when you say large herbivores, do you mean cattle, or would you also include deer, horses, or sheep? And could those periods without arable farming perhaps be periods where the large herbivores are wandering as wild or feral animals, but people have gone?
That is a potential. That's where that kind of animal bone analysis would be really, really interesting to look at more closely. So we probably wouldn't be seeing horses there, but certainly would likely be seeing cattle if they are being farmed. That's something that you do see in other Bronze and Iron Age sites, and quite possibly sheep would have been farmed as well, in fairly small numbers. So yeah, that is, I guess, a question. The presence of that kind of range of disturbance taxa, so that suggests that there are people moving through the landscape. But yeah, there is a potential that it could be, yeah, as you say, herds of red deer. That said, there are some cases, I know that some researchers have argued that red deer might have been kind of used as a sort of semi, not entirely farmed, but used quite strongly by communities in the Iron Age. There are some wheelhouse sites with a lot of red deer remains shown. So the way that people are interacting with animals in this period is another really interesting question. That idea of domesticity and how animals are moving through those upland regions, yeah, could definitely be looked at in more detail.
Thank you. That's all the questions that have come in, but if anyone has a question, you're still very welcome to type it in the chat. Don't know, do you have any other thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, I think something that we spoke about during the study really was, it's in the title that Hans provided in terms of that continuity, and that's thinking about whether we have an Iron Age or not at that site. The activity crosses into that period, but that's, a label we put onto it, chronologically speaking, but the activity, it kind of remains the same, doesn't it, all the way through? So, are we actually seeing continuation of Bronze Age living? Or do we have an actual change into an Iron Age society? So where does one begin and the other end, really?
Yeah, that's such a good point to be thinking about. That element of continuity is really strong, and I think that it does challenge some of those kind of quite ingrained ideas around what it meant to live in the Bronze Age and what it meant to live in the Iron Age, and what it meant to live in upland regions and what it meant to live in a hut circle. So yeah, I guess hopefully this research is, one of many projects starting to open up those questions of really trying to get into the lifeways of hut circle communities and dwellers in this period.
It's maybe
Yeah, and
data,
and
not dates for are you in the Iron Age? No, it's data, not dates. Sorry, over to you.
No, I was just going to say that, what we really want now is Tom and his excavation to uncover loads of charcoal that we can have a look at and see if there is woodland management going on, linked to the hazel and the alder that Hannah was talking about. We'd like some bone, and we'd like lots of cereal grain, and we'd just like lots more ecofactual material from those. Then to actually put that into context with what Hannah's producing, because we've now got a long-term record of change and things that are going on in the broader environment, but trying to whittle it down into what is going on at individual house sites, what activities are taking place, and how people within those buildings are interacting with the landscape. That's all still to be kind of eked out, and that excavation data would really help with that. So we're kind of looking forward to seeing what happens with that over the next few weeks.
Yeah, that will be exciting. I have a question here coming in now from Duncan, who's asking, in the comparison between the deforestation in Trotternish and your own site, is there a potential for managed woodland immediately surrounding domestic areas with the same level of deforestation in arable areas?
I think that I understand what you mean there. I think a good thing to think about in relation to these landscapes is maybe those kind of definitions between like what is an arable area and how people and sort of what that landscape looks like isn't so well defined. So for example, what we're seeing in Trotternish is quite significant woodland clearance in the wide area. That's not something we're seeing, as you can see from pond diagrams, that's not something that we're seeing in Gairloch. So immediately surrounding the hut circle sites, like wouldn't necessarily have been woodland. That might have been where people, in fact, were undertaking arable farming quite near to their homes, quite near to their hut circles. And that's something that further research would be useful to know about. And then it's that kind of wider environment of the upland birch that we're seeing is saying fairly stable. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Poor Duncan can't speak, but I would say yes. You could, here he comes. Interesting, thank you, he says. Okay, so if everybody's satisfied and happy with the answers to their questions. I think it's time now to thank Hannah. We can all applaud in our individual homes. Excellent, and congratulations again on your MRes.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up in the seminar series, we're doing the last Friday of October, and we'll hear from Emily Gall and Rebecca Vinell, who will be talking about their use of augmented reality, which is like Pokemon Go for archaeologists. Their title is Uist Unearthed, exploring applications of location-based augmented reality in an island landscape, and that's from the island of Uist. So last Friday of October, everybody put a circle in your calendar now. And thank you very much again, Hannah.
Thank you.